Good evening, Musa. How are you doing?
Hi, Jonathan. I'm very well. So how have things been?
They've been okay, but I want to get straight down to it today. I want to ask. This is thinking around the question. This is a discussion where we sort of look at things, but we don't necessarily come to conclusions. And I think we're a bit suspicious of conclusions. You've got your take as a psychiatrist. I've got my take as a sort of a social anthropologist, and somewhere in between we meet and we sort of have a conversation which is as honest as we can make it. So I was wondering, do you have a question? Is something on your mind that you're sort of asking at the moment?
Yeah, there's been something that's been bugging me. It's been bugging me for a few years since COVID, and it came back more recently. And I've never really got to the bottom of it. I'd really like to think about it today, and it's about conspiracy theories. So I'll just explain where this question came up from. I was speaking to a friend about particular it's a mad world, right? You could take any given day on in the last year, and there are mad things going on every day of the week, every week of the year. Um, and what I've noticed really interestingly is that we've all become a bit more conspiratorial. Um, so, you can have three or four friends talking about any current event, whatever's happening. Um, and everybody will have their sort of slightly different stance on things. Some of them begin to become a bit bizarre and a bit away with the fairies. And then some of them start to have kind of the ring of truth. And it's always made me. COVID was a perfect example of this, right? You know, so what exactly is a conspiracy theory? What isn't? And what are conspiracy theories about?
Okay, Before
I mean,
before
yeah,
I sort of
yeah,
ask you another question about that, and when you're
yeah.
listening to these conspiracy theories around you, are are you putting forward any yourself, or are you are
Of
you
course,
not?
Jonather. I
Well, are
think,
you? I
I
mean,
think,
that's. I mean, you so you do think you're putting forward conspiracy
well,
theories?
I think other people might think that I'm putting forward a conspiracy theory. Do you know? I mean, of course, I don't think that I'm being particularly conspiratorial. I think a really good example of this, I think, would be COVID, which obviously happened a few years ago, right? And there was, if you remember, a few years ago, there was this question about where did it originate from, and there were two main prevailing hypotheses, right? One was that it had come from a market in Wuhan, from essentially what was being suggested unhygienic practices when killing a particular mammal. I can't remember which one, um, and therefore it had just kind of gone from interspecies transmission between this particular species, jumps into humans, and then spread around the world. And then the other was that there was a lab leak in Wuhan, which was also working on, the lab was working on coronaviruses in Wuhan, which happened to be funded by America. Um, and there was some attempt to pin that or the approval of that to Dr. Anthony Fauci, who was at that time heading up the American response to COVID. I don't know if you recall all of
You
this,
see,
right?
this is what's beautiful about all
Yeah,
this stuff is I'd heard the stuff about the market and the is it pangolin? It's sort of an armadillo type thing,
yeah, yeah,
and
Pangolian. That's right. Yeah,
and and uh, and animal of the year really should have been on the newspapers. But and then and at the same time you've got the lab leak where they're investigating by sheer chance in the same place the very viruses that is coming out.
mm.
But I hadn't heard the Americans funding it story. I'd heard the Chinese cover-up story. So I mean, we're
Oh,
dealing with
sure. So,
we're dealing
so,
with the
so,
problem of
so this
information.
absolutely. So this conspiracy, it may not have been a conspiracy, right? It kind of grew legs, especially in, I believe, in America, where the Republicans, especially the ones who were anti-Fauci, um, started blaming Fauci for funding these kind of things. There were congressional hearings on these. Now, I have to say, Jonathan, that I do not know whether COVID originated from the market or from
Isn't this old
the
news?
lab. It's
Isn't this
very
old
old
news,
news.
Musa? So what's
It's
the
very old news.
why are you dragging up old news like this? That's unlike you. Let's talk about something.
It's
I mean, it's not like you. So
yeah.
what is it about? What is it about the conspiracy theory, whatever that is? What are you really trying to find out?
But John, I'm we're a bit zoomed out of it now. This is happening right now, where um, the conspiracy theory, and I'm saying it because we're zoomed out of it. That conspiracy grew legs, right, and it led to massively different opinions between different camps about vaccines, whether we should be having vaccines or not, whether this was planted in some way, whether it was due to uh, some kind of institutional corruption. um, all of these things were tangled into that discussion, if you remember, right? And getting to the bottom of whether we can trust the institutions that are supposed to be looking after us, whether we can trust them, whether we should do as they advise us, whether they are really thinking about our interest. That's absolutely fundamental, isn't it, for working society? And it was these whole ideas of a lack of trust in government were instrumental in thinking about how to respond to COVID. And it's going on again today. We can see this. You could take any current affair topic and you could look at the same thing. It's about institutional trust.
So let's say that's one of the elements. But I think
Yeah,
we can unpack and ask questions
sure.
around that, because what we're asking questions about really is what is the nature of knowledge? What is the nature of the dissemination of knowledge and the communication of knowledge? And who are we when we hear knowledge, and what sort of knowledge do we want to hear, depending who we are and what we want to believe? And I could ask you this as a psychiatrist, if I have distrusting relationships as a child, do I have distrusting relationships with information I'm given as an adult? And then you have the technologies of knowledge dissemination, which have changed
Mm,
from a few media outlets to which we knew who they were more or less. We could sort of see who they were. They were like sort of old uncles in the room at a wedding. You knew what they were like. But now we've just got information coming through, and I've just spent just before this call.
mm.
Totally ironically, um, someone was telling me that they felt we were all being controlled by one family, and they recently thought this was they'd seen it on a documentary that one family was controlling all of us, which for a documentary makes a fantastic story. I mean, it's brilliant, isn't it? You
Yeah,
come away, it's
sorry,
the drama.
Jonathan. I have to ask. You just left it. Wouldn't it happen? I mean, were they suggesting that that family had a particular ethnicity, or was it?
This is another.
Yeah,
So this is there. There's a documentary by Adam Curtis. I haven't seen it. And
sure.
Adam Curtis does a very cherry picked version of history where he just says this definitely led to that. This definitely led to this, and it
Mm,
all. You know, and in it, there's always an inbuilt fear and paranoia and control going on. We're being controlled, and some of it's very, probably very good to think with. Other bits of it problematic. So somewhere in this, the Freud family, Jewish,
okay.
I presume, but they are controlling everything, or at least that's how my friend heard it. And she goes, and I don't really want to believe that, but they must be controlling it, and therefore they must be controlling my thoughts of them controlling it. Because,
Oh,
or the possibility was that the documentary was breaking through the control. There was this voice, and this is what the conspiracy does. There's a story, which forget about the validity, but the conspiracy says, I break through your story. I transcend your story. It's a very evangelical moment. I'm not of your story. I can see the true world, and what you've painted is not true. You could talk about Maya, the illusion. You could talk about you know the distrust of the world, and therefore this story breaks through. And I'm interested in your terms as a psychiatrist. Do you
um,
think there's a relationship between our distrust of knowledge and our belief in these rebel messages that come out and tell us not to believe any of that? and how we are as children in our own parenting.
So that, I mean, if you wanted to unpack that question is absolutely massive. As a psychiatrist, you could look at it through several different lenses, right? One of which you've just alluded to, right? But that will only be part of the picture. So I think it's beyond doubt now that our childhood attachment styles, whether we have secure, insecure attachments, will affect our certainty, our trust in the world, and our future relationships. In fact, that was Freud's, I think, one of Freud's great contributions to psychiatry, psychoanalysis. I think there were lots of things in Freud which are completely incorrect, but I think that was his great contribution. Um, and certainly, those relationships, which is, you transfer from one situation to another, which is called transference, right? Sometimes in colloquial terms, rather disparagingly, we call it baggage, right? She's got baggage, he's got baggage from his previous relationships, but I think it is correct to say that if we have secure attachment styles from childhood, we're more likely to have secure attachment styles, more trusting attachment styles in adulthood. If we have insecure attachment styles where we can't quite trust or believe the information, we're going to be more insecure as we grow older. And we're not going to form the same kind of trust, both with individuals and with institutions. And this can be seen on an individual level. It can also be seen on a population level. So for example, um, one of the experiences that I've had as a psychiatrist is working with people from Afro-Caribbean backgrounds, who can sometimes, some individuals from those backgrounds can be very mistrusting of mental health services, and it takes really some time to step back and realize why that is. It's because of things such as the Tuskegee syphilis study. I don't know if you know about this. Awful medical disaster. So there was, I think it was in Tuskegee, or I might be pronouncing it incorrectly, where in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, the treatment for syphilis was well known. Penicillin could have been given, but because they wanted to see, that the researchers wanted to see the natural effects of syphilis, because it's a very fascinating, interesting disorder. Incidentally, as a medic, right, it's fascinating. They left all these individuals who are predominantly from this Black African American community completely untreated, right? And there's been many, many similar, situations. So there is a historical distrust, right, of institutions. So it's not just on an individual um, basis. It can also this can also be across societies, where previous experiences lead to transference of a lack of trust, a distrust in our contemporary relations. Does that make sense? Right.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
that's one side of it, and I will leave it there. But then the other side of it, which we could come back to in a minute, is psychosis, and what is the nature of certainty, knowing, and knowledge, because that's in itself a very fascinating question. And that rather than looking at attachment styles, you might begin to consider that from thinking about neurobiology, and how we construct knowledge. But yeah, I'm interested to hear your feedback about that, Jonathan.
I'm fascinated by the second one. I'm going to start with the
Yeah.
first one because I mean, what you're also describing is parts of population that are abandoned and exploited,
Mm,
which is what happens in unequal worlds where there's acceptable discrimination, or socially acceptable
yeah.
discrimination, but that leads to a lack of trust. But if you have a system where, if you like, the role of the state and the role of your neighbours is less about you, the role is about self-preservation, the me society, the let's look after myself, let's me first, And then you emphasize that with a whole set of technologies, which are all personalizations. So you live in your own world. It's all about you. It's all about set. And then you've got your private transportation and your private this and everything, and you're just setting it in your own thing. Then actually there's a communal abandonment going on, because there is an mass elective to go down individual lines. And at that point, are you setting people up to be more distrustful of information in general? But that's not what's going on. The conspiracy isn't about distrust of information. It's about the trust and distrust of information. Or what we call conspiracy, because, of course, the thing that the people I would say are into conspiracies think I'm into conspiracies.
Yeah.
There's that going on. So it's got, in a sense, it's got nothing to do with the conspiracy. It's got to do, and we could be very relativist about it. And I'm sometimes tempted, but I have to stop myself, because the relative says, well, you've got this knowledge, I've got this knowledge, they've got this knowledge. How do all these knowledges come together? And that, in a sense, that's quite right. If we put them all together, we can actually see where we are. If we just put them on the table as neutral objects, I think this, you think this, I think one family's controlling it, I think nothing can be controlled, I think this. And let's look at all those. And well, there's ways of doing it. We get into the archaeology of it. We could try and trace it back, just like having an argument with your other half, and you're trying to trace back the cause of the argument. Well, that's never going to resolve it. It's just going to cause further dispute. You're not really communicating. You're trying to problem solve. So how, with all these different stories going on and everyone's consuming them in different places, how do you actually know what's going on without tracing back? Because, of course, you can't trace back because you're simply reliant on other knowledge chains. So there is no chasing back. So I think the other question becomes, what do those knowledges give us? What do we want from them?
Well, yeah.
But there's one more problem, as far as I see it, is that this is very real world. We see the world it's going through a revolution. It's going through mass change. There's strong parallels with previous revolutions, a total distrust of the existing system, which leads people to embrace a totally highly problematic system as an alternative. That's what happens in revolution. We can romanticize revolution, but actually there's a system which is no longer serving usually the elites of one form or another, or the masses, or in some cases both. And then that system is overthrown, and people support something which is often far worse, or fairly soon turns into the same system they just got rid of. And I'm sure this period of time will be no different. But information is crucial in this, because before it was just the gossip. Mm-hmm. But now people, because they read it somewhere, because they saw a documentary, they kind of believe all that stuff, and they do their own research, quote unquote, and they believe it, and they do what Adam Curtis does, and they cherry pick the narratives which form a bigger narrative, and they end up. So I think the thing is, how do we approach knowledge? Not in a relativistic way.
Yeah.
How do we approach it?
As an aside, have you ever come across David Icke?
I've come across David Icke. I've even seen him speak ages ago when he was.
Oh, is it? Okay.
He was the leader of the Green Party many years ago. And
was he?
Oh, yeah, many years ago. Back in the 80s, I think, somewhere in, where was it? Southgate, I think I was in North London, and we went to see him speak. And I think he was just on the edge of becoming somewhere else. Yeah, so he's got... Why? What's going on with him? Is he still...
No, David Icke has... doesn't he have this conspiracy theory that we're controlled by lizards or reptiles? Or... Yeah, and I've had patients quote this to me, by the way, in ward rounds, Yeah, so they... Patients with serious mental illness, right? Yeah, go on.
Well, this is... So, without disparaging psychosis in any shape or form, are people who are in psychiatric hospitals or psychiatric settings more likely, as a percentage, to believe the more sort of outlandish or extreme forms of theories of knowledge? And if so, do they therefore gain value from we're controlled by lizards? Is that useful? Okay. I mean, I worked psychiatrics once, and someone felt he was in touch with King Arthur, but that's a very different matter.
yeah. So there's some evidence that, well, there's a lot of evidence that people with psychosis will jump to conclusions more easily, right? Whether they subscribe to the outlandish group conspiracies, um, that that, I don't know, cults may hold or others may hold. I'm not sure of evidence for that. Certainly, having spoken to many people with psychosis, and treated many, uh, they they can adapt what are called delusional systems, very conspiratorial kind of mindsets, relating to themselves. But whether they subscribe to a group conspiracy, uh, uh, or more, they are more likely to be predisposed. And we can talk about that. I want to talk about that, but I just want to, um, pick up on a few of your earlier points, right? So what one of the things you were asking is, what are we looking for in this kind of information overload? I think this is really important, Jonathan. Um, we essentially, I think, as a species, we want certainty. We're very uncomfortable with uncertainty. We really don't know what to do with it. And so, certainty means certain knowledge. And we have developed techniques, and ideas about certain knowledge. I mean, one way of certain knowledge for some people, for myself including myself, is the word of God. That's certainty. There's a kind of religious didactic. This is the word of God. In fact, the Quran starts with, "This is the perfect book. There's no doubt in it." Yeah. After the introductory chapter, that's exactly what it says, right? So, and that's been a very important aspect of, I think, human society, civilization, over the last 10,000 years. There are other ways that, of course, in any other setting, we have to live with this problem of uncertainty, isn't it? Um, and of course, religion doesn't answer all of life's, many, foibles and issues, and, the different situations that we have to deal with. We have to deal with uncertainty as a species. Um, the other way that we sometimes deal with uncertainty is through consensus. I don't know if you ever picked up on this, Jonathan, right? So, if I don't know, if I make a mistake, for example, as a clinical doctor, what will happen? My medical director will pick me up and say, "Okay, I'm going to put you in front of a panel of 3 doctors who will review your decision making and decide whether or not you made the right decision or not." Why? Why would those 3 doctors be? They might all be wrong, right? But essentially, we have this idea of a panel, and the idea of the panel, the Inquisition panel, has been there from time immemorial, right? That's what democracy is all about, isn't it? What happens if, in terms of democracy, the idea of democracy is it's very uncertain how we are going to run this country. There's many affairs that need to be sorted out, whether or not we need to leave the European Union, or, oh, that's great, or Scotland needs to leave Britain. Let's have a referendum about it. Why would they necessarily make the right decision? Especially if you're just saying that, well, that's just the mob, the hoi polloi. But we have this inbuilt within us, that if if another person and another person and a mass of people make the same decision, maybe somehow we're getting to that certainty, isn't it? And so, yeah, go on.
Well, I think that's where this is why I don't think the word conspiracy works. I don't
Yeah.
think a whole load of in a sense, as we go through a period of strong social change, so the words and the language we have doesn't work so well. So we now talk about a right-wing governments that don't have right-wing economic policies. They're not into free markets. They're into highly controlled markets by leverage or whatever, but they're not free markets. But we'll call them right-wing. Well, it doesn't work anymore. These terminologies don't work so well. And I think this word conspiracy doesn't really do it justice, because the the thing we're talking about is a thing that cuts through the existing norm of truth, and it can cut through it as an individual of the small gathering, or it can cut through it with a large amount of people. But it's cutting through is cutting through some form of mainstream thought and creating its own mainstream thought. And we can look at that and we can go, oh, but this is how knowledge progresses. We're back to Thomas Kuhn and his paradigmatic understanding of the philosophy of knowledge, that we go through sort of groups of knowledge and there's revolutions that overtake them. Well, and normally those revolutions are taken quite badly at the time. People don't quite like it because it gets rid, so all of a sudden the sun isn't the center of the earth, isn't the center of the universe, and there's Ptolemy going, I think it's the sun. This sun worshipper thinks it's the sun, and thus it becomes the sun for many times to come. Galileo goes, oh, hang on, I've just had a look at the heavens through a telescope I made, and gets thrown in jail. So the changes aren't welcome, but we have a change at the moment which is about overthrowing existing forms of government, existing forms of knowledge, existing institutions. But it doesn't seem to be based in that. It seems to be based in one of the phrases, "Might is right." So it's not based necessarily on knowledge. It's based on the power to produce knowledge. So what the internet gives us is the power to produce mass knowledge from it's hard to trace source, and to have mass consumption of knowledge, and have to have sort of things of higher consumptive value than others. So we start following certain people and not others, who are themselves then sponsored in various ways and promoted in various ways. And we have the people who control those platforms apparently not doing anything to tweak anything to their advantage, but this would seem very unlikely to anyone who ever owned a media outlet in their life. The point is to tweak. And we're all caught up in it. We're not totally controlled by it, but we're strongly influenced by it. It's the weather. I mean, the weather doesn't control my actions, but it sure does influence them. I might not go out if it's rainy and windy. So we've got this sort of thing going on. We've got the power of knowledge rather than what the actual knowledge is.
But is that knowledge, Jonathan? That's information, right? I mean, sometimes it's called the what you're talking about is an information revolution, right? And sometimes it's called the democratization of information. The fact that anybody can I don't know, set up and do a podcast. There's 1,000 voices blaring out at the internet.
And here's proof.
Of course, yeah. And so, but that's not knowledge.
So is what we're saying knowledge?
Listen, let me just think about a medical topic. Appendicitis, right? How do you know that an appendix is inflamed? How do you know that is not inflamed? How do you know that it might be something else? How do you know when to take it out? How do you know what to do after it, right? That's knowledge, right? Now, when I see a case of, what's called a surgical abdomen, this is many, many years ago when I was a house officer, that I need to know a few, 4 or 5 salient facts, right? And everything else, Jonathan, I can just completely disregard, right? If that appendix needs to be operated on, and I've got in trouble for not picking this up before, so I remember this very well. I need to contact the surgeon straight away, and explain to them exactly what's going on. Yeah, and there's only 4 or 5 different variables that you need to know, right? What I'm saying is that the information that I'm getting, all that mass of information, which I really struggle with as a junior doctor, as everybody does. You get masses of information. You have the wife saying, oh, he killed over at 6 o'clock. You have the daughter saying, oh, no, I think it was 7 o'clock. You have the patient himself saying, no, I didn't kill over at all. And, then you have them all debating. I've been in these situations about how much alcohol he drinks. It's completely irrelevant, right? What's the knowledge, the key knowledge is the salient facts, the judgment that you need to do to sort out that situation. So, but what I'm going to say is that knowledge it's pares down to a few fundamentals, and it'll be the same for you, Jonathan. If you think about your field of anthropology, you have lots and lots of different information, but you will have a framework, a way of looking at things, and if you can interpret that information in the context of your framework, That's real knowledge, and that's real power, especially if the framework is correct. If the framework is worthless, then it's worthless. Yep, go on.
So here lies, I think it's a lovely example you give.
Mm.
And I notice now I'm using the AI as my doctor. I'm asking it questions, and it's coming up with reasonable answers. Um, but here's what's going on as an analogy
Yeah,
of that. You're saying as a doctor, you're getting all this information coming in. It's coming in from the patient, the patient's family. It might be coming in from observations people made. And you have to select what's important, what's not important, based upon your training and based upon instinct and based upon working some things out. And you've got to sift through that. Now let's take your average consumption of knowledge day.
mm.
So you wake up, let's say you pick up your phone or you just look out the window. Let's say you look out the window. You're still consuming knowledge. You're looking out and you're consuming knowledge about the weather, and it's fitting into your existing ideas of the weather. Or the car goes down the street and it's noisy, or whatever it is. Kids are going to school. That's all going on. All that sounds, and that's knowledge that everything's much the same as it was yesterday. And you pick up
Mm.
your phone and you look through that, and now you're starting to get information. And depending where you're going, because you can go lots and lots of places, you're getting different information. And you're having to decide what's important, what's not. And then you've got other things to do. You've got to get your breakfast and your cereal and all this. And this is going on constantly, all day. And it's gone on one way or the other. You've been absorbing knowledge all your
Sure,
life.
sure.
And who is to say what are the salient facts? Who are to say what's right and what's wrong? And as you consume digital knowledge, that information, there are people telling you, and there are people persuading you with very good narrative techniques.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
what they're saying is better than what someone else is saying. And I mean, I got a slight injury, an SI joint injury. So I looked up on YouTube exercises for an SI joint injury. But I'm just as bombarded with videos that saying don't do this as a video saying do this. This is the 5 big mistakes people make with this injury. The 5 key solutions people make.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, yeah.
everyone's selling knowledge. It's a marketplace of knowledge, and we're getting saturated with it. So, what matters is the power of people's communication and the weight of momentum behind that, which itself might be linked to the platforms itself and the political allegiances of those platforms.
So the thing is that perhaps the way that we evaluate knowledge is faulty. You know, we will evaluate knowledge. You know, if have you come across the conformity studies? You know, I think these are Ash's conformity studies of maybe 50s or 60s. Have you come across these studies? This
I don't
fantastic
think so.
study. When you start doing a S and A level psychology, you know, so basically, Ash, I believe he was the researcher. He got 2 people to draw lines. Yeah, so small, short line, long line, right?
Yeah.
And then he asked, you know, it was essentially an a behavioral experiment. So he had the lines drawn very closely together. Then he asked, you know, a number of actors in front of the actual participant who didn't know that the others were actors, are these lines the same or different? And they would be slightly different. And anybody looking at them would say, well, they're very different, right? But the 9 people in front of the participants say, don't they're the same? Then they'd ask the participant who would just say, oh yeah, they're the same. Would get confused. You know, I'm sure you've been in that situation. I've certainly been in that situation. There were a number of behavioral experiments which showed this idea of conformity. Some of them very funny. You know, everybody walks into an elevator. The participant is in the elevator looking this way. Everybody looks to the back. And they have a video camera in the elevator. And slowly over 20 or 30 seconds, you see their individual turn around to look and face
Yes.
the wall itself. You know, so we conform in terms of our understanding and our value of knowledge. And perhaps we shouldn't be doing that. Perhaps we should be. Yeah, go on.
Well, I mean, you've got Kahneman's book on the thinking fast, thinking slow, um,
Yeah,
which is critical because, of course, it showcases these insights from behavioural psychology. And it
yeah, yeah,
showcases that when we're not
yeah, yeah.
thinking how we think we're thinking, something else is going on, and we're not making decisions based upon rationale. We're making decisions in other ways, and we've got other books like Nudge, which was all about how
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah.
how to persuade things to another place. And we've got a few sort of seminal books in the last 20, 30 years. Now, in a sense, the people writing them are sort of writing them to say, well, look, take a look. It's far less secure out there than you think. You're doing a whole load of things which don't make sense. And if you want to improve systems, we can work with this. But there's other people reading those books going, hang on, how do I use this now to persuade people? I know. I'll make them feel something's more familiar. Because if it's familiar, they'll be more persuaded to it. I'm going to make them smile while I give them a message, and they're going to believe it more. Here are all the tricks of the trade, guys. I mean, there's a very famous person who wrote about peace processes, and his name was I think it's Roger Black, and he wrote this book, and it had the sort of 10 key rules of
Hmm.
peace process, what to do. And there was a world leader, very famous, who studied. Interesting enough, he studied under this guy, or under one of the co-authors, and he then proceeded to do the very opposite of the 10 rules because he didn't want peace. He just
Mm,
he just went against it. So you've got great insights into behavior and how to change behavior and how
mm.
people behave. Are these books just being used in a sort of for the benefit of humankind? Or are they being used politically? Are they being used by
Oh
advertisers?
no,
Are they being used?
Jonathan, it was fascinating that the point that you made that somebody believes that the Freud family is controlling the world, because obviously I wouldn't agree with it. I wouldn't subscribe to it. What I would say uh, is that this is exactly how, a great example of how Freud changed the world in very important ways, right? So many of these theories, nudge theory, Kahneman's work, all of these kind of things, this would not have really, they would not really have taken place if I don't believe if Freud hadn't been so instrumental in kind of developing theories of the unconscious, of the subconscious mind, of subconscious drives. Yeah, Freud's family, as you know, very gifted family, the painters, um, and advertisers as well, and gifted in all sorts of ways, right? But essentially, what happened is that our subconscious drives and the probably recognition of how important they were, around 120, 130 years ago, have become instrumentalized in all sorts of ways. You know, that's what all this, nudge theory and, Kahneman's work is all about. Kahneman, actually, in that book, he traces it out. I think he worked at times for the Israeli army. He worked at other times for American universities. He worked for, advertising. He's given the kind of experiments and the learning he's doing alongside, right? So he's giving a really good demonstration of, and now what we've got in this AI age is that we now have the data points to begin to see exactly how these things work in real time. That's why, clickbait and all of these other kind of things have become so important, and it's become a means of control of the popular vote, of our commercial decision making. So these things have become instrumentalized, right?
So,
And that is worrying for us because that is affecting our basic understanding of knowledge.
so can I flip it now
Yeah,
because we're in
yeah,
a very precarious place because of the nature of what we're saying. Because we are now putting forward our own theory of how these systems are now conspiring, and there are people, groups. We haven't said one family, but we've said
sure.
there are groups of people who are now using these texts. They've got their evil texts, and they've turned them into evil texts, and they're using them to control populations to their own means. So we're saying that, and not only are we saying that, we're now agreeing with each other about it, so we feel even more about it. And there we sit with other beliefs. I mean, you believe you have a perfect book, which is overseen. The
Mm-hmm.
conspiracy of all conspiracies. There's this God overseeing us
Mm-hmm.
and controlling our actions, or asking us to be accountable to our actions. And of course, that is, you're surrounded by actors who agree with that, so it makes it more agreeable to
Well,
you.
yeah.
And
I mean,
I've got my own stuff. So
but
how do
the
you?
thing is, Jonathan, I mean, yeah, when does I think the question that arises from that is when does it become a conspiracy, right?
But how do you differentiate? It's not that, I suppose they're almost the same question. But how can you differentiate? And this is the problem. The world could be burning, and we could still be going. How can you tell what you're saying is true? How can you tell what I'm saying is true? I mean, I also see the instrumentalization of Foucault. Power is knowledge. Well, okay, let's play with that to our advantage. But how can you tell that what we're saying isn't? I mean, there are some people who feel that the person on the psychiatric ward who believed David Icke should be sprung from there, and that psychiatry itself is a conspiracy theory. How do you? How can you differentiate?
Mm. Let's um let's take the conversation back to psychosis because I do want to talk about the
Do
biology
I?
of this
Maybe
before.
because I think there's
Yeah,
a yeah. I think it'll be
yeah,
possible.
but when we start thinking about psychosis, specifically about delusions, right? What is a delusion? Um, and there's all kinds of claims about what a delusion is. In the uh, general colloquial literature, the word is bandied about. A delusion is a fixed, unshakable belief held with conviction, um, for which there is no objective evidence. That's what a delusion is, right? And then there are some exclusion criteria, right? One of the exclusion criteria is which is not culturally, which is not culturally appropriate, right? So hence, by definition, you cannot have a God delusion, as Dawkins said, right? Because belief in God is completely culturally appropriate, right? Similarly, in terms of conspiracy theories, right? I think that if we need to think about certain um, exclusion criteria before we start calling something a conspiracy. One of it is that it can't be a conspiracy by definition if it's true. Kind of like UK defamation law, right? It's a get out of jail clause. You cannot defame somebody on facts which are true.
But how do you determine what's true?
Well, I mean, if it's true, if there happens to be, which I don't happen to believe, right, a family which is all controlling us, and I just don't see it, you don't see it, the rest of society doesn't see it, but there's one bright spark in Land's End or John O'Groats or wherever, who's waving the flag and saying that no, this family is controlling us. They're not conspiratorialists. It's not conspiracy theory. It's just true. It's something that nobody else has picked up on, right?
I'm not very
There's
satisfied with
that.
the answer. I think it's
Oh,
highly,
really?
highly problematic. But I think it's
Can you?
problematic to
Can
answer.
Yeah, of course. Can you have true conspiracy theories, though, Jonathan?
Well, the thing is, you're saying there's some sort of objective truth. Do you think psychosis is an objective truth?
That's a loaded question. It's not fair to ask, but I can.
Why? Why is that loaded?
When I think about psychosis, I think about the neurochemical processes behind it, which I can explain because I think it's important to this conversation, right? But yeah, if you're going to ask me, um, do do I, my patients when they're in the throes of psychosis, because obviously people suffering from psychosis are not psychotic all the time. Yeah, I think that's important to say. And when they tend to be experiencing psychotic states, they tend to be very unwell, and it tends to be obvious to everybody. Yeah, but no, I don't agree with their psychosis, or their psychotic experiences when they tell me that they are, um,
Yeah, but
they,
you agree
yeah.
with the diagnosis.
Yes, of course. Yeah. But
But
I don't
that's
agree
because
with that.
within the
There's,
culture you work within, there is a diagnosis
mm,
of psychosis. In other societies or in other times, there's it hasn't been labelled as such, and it becomes different things in different places. Those sort of behaviours. Some are more revered than others, and therefore that changes who that
no,
person is against
I
theirs.
think that is. I think that statement itself is problematic. Is grossly simplifying things. I'm not going to do a history of madness talk right now. We could do that. We should do it in the
But
future.
okay,
But
but
you know,
do you see the point? We're back to what's objective knowledge and what's not objective knowledge. What is objective knowledge?
sure.
I mean, what is objective knowledge? Because you're saying, I mean, you've got this very strange definition where
Mm,
there's anything that goes against objective knowledge, whatever that is. I'm not quite sure what it is, unless there's a cultural practice uh, which they're now adhering to. Well, what if, as a cultural practice, people went against objective knowledge, and then someone said, "No, that, I disagree with your cultural practice."
yeah. No, so absolutely. So what I am saying, and I've said earlier on, is that one of the ways that we approximate to certainty is through consensus, isn't it? You know,
Hmm.
if there's something there's a consensus around or lots of people agree on, we say, well, that's okay. It's reasonable to believe that. That might not be correct. That's an approximation, right? We cannot, for certainty, right, know that that patient in front of me um, is deluded. It's possible, it's true, but given that there's no objective evidence, that I would suggest, it's a delusion. And to be honest, Jonathan, if we let that go, I think this is really important. This crucial last point. If we let that go, and say, oh, well, we can never know objective reality, and I really start questioning myself as a psychiatrist and losing myself in this, I wouldn't treat patients, people wouldn't get better. I give them medication, I treat them, they get better. I think I have to accept that as a certainty, that there is something called delusions, there is something called objective
Yeah,
reality.
but now look what's happened. You're saying, in my position and my
Yeah,
responsibilities to
sure,
others,
sure.
I have to say, look, there are certain certainties here. Otherwise,
Yeah, yeah.
people are going to suffer. But I can also imagine if I was in a position of government, I would be telling myself similar narratives. And I read a story the other day. They were talking to a politician who was of one side, but he was a minority opinion in his side. And they said,
Mm,
what are your colleagues thinking? He said, most of them are convincing themselves that everything is right. And he said they're taking the most absurd stories to convince themselves. But we're back in this thing of what how do you get certainty, and with responsibility comes the importance of telling a narrative to make yourself more certain of it, and in that you can objectivize knowledge, and I can give you examples. There are and have been uh, genocides where you
mm,
objectifies the reason for the genocide, and a lot of the time you'll have academics who are on the side of, of violent projects, and they legitimate it, and they produce
mm.
historians,
Yeah, yeah.
biologists. I mean, it keeps going. Academics are very much involved in violence. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Not a lot of them, but the key players.
Well, no. A lot of them certainly. Yeah.
So they objectivize the necessity for this, which we might later go, or we
Mm.
might from a different place go, that's really awful, but it becomes objectively necessary. So knowledge. So what I'm trying to say is, rather than try and find instant certainty, and rather than play the relative, oh, they said this, I said this, well, I don't know, because it's got very real world consequences. It's what do we do where we have the force of the value of certain knowledges? What do we do with that? And when can we take stock in a world which is increasing the amount of knowledge? There's a lovely bit in the Tao Te Ching, which I sent you a
Mm.
copy. It says when there's a lot of knowledge in the world, it's actually very problematic.
Mm.
It's not coming from some cosmic place. It's an observation of society in change. This is suddenly there's a lot of ideas and a lot of stuff
Mm.
going on, and it's very unsettling. And then people start creating stories to make it more
Mm.
settled. Objective, not objective, I don't know. So coming back to your thing, what do you do with a conspiracy? If you can't prove it's conspiratorial and that you're not part of another conspiracy, what do you do?
Okay, I'm going to come back with 2 points, right? I think firstly, the idea of objective truth and knowledge is important. I know, for example, that I have a wife and children and 2 parents, right? I also know, Jonathan, that you have 2 parents, right? Although I've never met them, I'm
It's too late.
I'm certainly I'm
Next world.
I'm certainly true of that. I'm certainly apprised of that fact, right? I think it's important for us to have some degree of certain knowledge, for us to be able to make decisions about, what we're going to do next. The question is, how do we determine certainty? And one of the things is that it's probably a biological phenomenon. So one of the things about certainty, in terms of which I find really fascinating in terms of psychosis. So psychosis is, and there's lots of different theories. There's lots of different interpretations. There's lots of different neurochemical understandings, right? Some of which are a conflict with each other. We don't understand it fully. But one of the overriding understandings that we've come to over the last 40 or 50 years is the central role of dopamine, or what's called a D2 receptor, in our in psychosis. And essentially, when we have too much dopamine, it appears that dopamine is a kind of chemical which is involved in salience, or attributing importance to the environment. When we have too much of it, then we begin to attribute importance to different elements of the environment. We begin to experience, the delusions. We begin to experience the hallucinations. So delusions, as I've talked about, are beliefs without an objective basis. The hallucinations are perceptions without an objective basis. We can become very muddled or confused, have something called formal thought disorder. And essentially, what we find, and I treat this often, is that if we begin to block the dopamine 2 receptor in key areas of the brain called the striatum through some simple medication which we could give, what I find really fascinating is when people begin to come back to certainty, begin to come back to reality. It's often a function of medication. Often, you know. So I can often tell you that a patient comes into the ward very, very unwell, and by day 14, I can't tell you exactly which patient, but I've seen this so many times before. By day 14, you stop the cannabis, the weed, the psychotomimetics that they've been taking. You start them on these medications, and they will approach you as much more gathered, much more well thought through, much more together, and much more in touch with reality. So there is certainly a chemical process underlying certainty. And that in itself, for me, actually is very troubling, because there's a chemical aspect to ourselves which we don't think about. You and I have not been thinking about what chemicals are going on in our brain, right now as we're appraising this.
I mean, can I ask you a question? Because dopamine is kind of, I mean, there's trends of knowledge, and right now, dopamine is the DNA. What DNA was when they discovered it.
Sure,
Dopamine is, I'm sure, about 10% of the internet has the word dopamine written in it.
It goes
And one of the things we understand is that our interactions with our phones and with the fast moving age is a deliberate attempt to cause us to create more dopamine. Is that in
yeah.
any way related to what you're talking about, or is it totally
Sure,
different?
very probably no, Jonathan. It probably is, but we haven't worked it out just yet. Dopamine is involved in reward and pleasure, and somewhat strangely, but it makes sense if you think about it. It shapes learning, right? So when we learn, when we pass an exam, we get this kind of pleasurable dopamine release, right? You know, when we take coke or methamphetamine or these kind of things, we have this huge kind of dopamine surge, which is intensely pleasurable, euphoric, which shortcuts our reward systems and all of these kind of things, right? So dopamine is kind of really deeply coded into our brain. It has lots of different actions on the brain, but one of these actions, which a specific action which I've been talking about, is our kind of appraisal of events and the shaping of reality. You know, and so teasing out all how this all comes together is not exactly understood by neuroscientists, but we understand the interrelations between this, which is why psychosis is often associated with addiction, um, and
But we
problems
we
with
have,
reward as well.
but
Yeah,
so we have an issue. If we are all
yeah,
and pretty much everyone, the world
mm,
population, more and more is engaged in this dopamine feed. This
yeah,
thing, this phone is just feeding us more and more of this stuff, and taking us here, there, and everywhere, and feeding us this stuff. So I think we've had this discussion before, where you were talking about the thing with the doctors, and the thing is, because everyone was smoking, it was very hard to find out that the smoking was
yeah,
causing
yeah.
problems because everyone's doing it. So if everyone's using the phone and is it possible that the world is going slightly psychotic and we won't know? And just to add to your further points, that actually becomes a cultural norm, and that our understandings of knowledge and all of that, and what psychosis is, has to therefore
Listen,
change because it becomes a cultural norm.
Jonathan, one thing I do not understand from my colleagues, and maybe my ADHD colleagues may have this all wrapped up, and I've just been behind on my continuing professional development and so on and so forth. But one thing I really do not understand is, why have we had this massive rise in ADHD diagnosis? Why have we had this, what feels like tremendous demand upon mental health services, which we're not able to keep up with, because it feels like we've got more psychiatrists now, even more consultant psychiatrists, and more mental health workers, and than ever before. Some people say this is down to awareness. I'm not sure awareness explains it all. I feel that people make themselves aware when they need to solve a problem, right? And has the fact that our life, our living, our changed, and of course social media, smartphones, and these kind of things are involved in that. I don't have the answers to that, Jonathan. You know.
Is have we got the modern equivalent of lead that the Romans had? The lead pipes were poisoning them more slowly and
Hmm.
making them. Do you think
Jon-
we might be on
yeah.
those edges?
If they were, how would we know?
Well,
Unless
exactly.
you pose the question and you do a observational cohort study, followed up for 20 years. How would you know?
Well, I can give you a very simple anecdote.
Yeah.
I did this because of someone else's anecdote. I put a shortcut into my phone to make it a black and white screen. As soon as the screen is black and white, the phone becomes a chore. It's just something you have to go. Okay, I'll have a look at it. But
Jonathan,
it's
that
this.
is
Hang
beautiful.
on. It loses all pleasure, and then here's the thing: because we've talked about my ADHD or whatever it is, and we've talked about this has been going on for a long time. We looked at my school reports, and it's clearly a long time. And I was saying I think I need
Hmm.
some medication. I'm finding it hard to cope. I go to black and white. I follow. I read a story about Jeff Bezos. Not look. The whole family doesn't look at their phone and they take a slow morning. I thought, well, I'll give that one a go. And the chaos. I mean, okay, it's messy as hell there. I don't, once again, don't look beneath the screen. But the chaos has really subsided. Why is that? Less phone.
So, okay, that's beautiful. Firstly, I'm going to learn how to do that. But
There you
secondly,
go.
one really interesting experience that I had, so I have kids, they take my phone. I haven't given them a smartphone. I'm keeping, son is 14. He's really angry. All his mates have smartphones. He doesn't have one. Yeah. Obviously, they take my phone and the wife's phone whenever they can. They're playing all these games and stuff. They do this thing which I used to do when I was a kid, and I used to play computer games. They keep losing on the game. You get to a certain level or whatever, we start getting really, really angry. Start almost cursing at the phone. Say, "Oh no, I did that." This kind of thing, right? And I can see them in real time. Over the 20, 30 minutes that they're playing on this game. Often sitting in the back of my car, or getting more and more angry. And then I suddenly take the phone away from them. Then they get really angry about. If I keep the phone away from them for a couple of weeks, which I've done before, I've kept them grounded and all of these kind of things, behavior improves markedly, markedly. And so I can see in my own children, I've spoke to this with many other parents, their phones worsen, impulsive behavior. And now, whether that leads to mental disorder, that's a stretch. I can't make that claim. But you can certainly see how these experiences shape our behaviors, right?
Can I therefore ask you a final
Yeah.
question? Do you think, as a sort of slightly philosophical paradox, would it be possible for there to be a viral trend of switching off your phone, or at least not following any viral trends? Would it be possible to have a viral trend that ended viral trending? Would it be possible to have something going around on the internet? The latest hack was don't use all this stuff. Would that be possible, or is that impossible?
Jonathan, if I asked you 5 years ago, is it possible that there's a lab on the other side of the world that has, all these procedures in place to store viruses, and a virus may release from there, affect the whole of the world and cause global pandemonium and shut down? What would you say to that?
I would
If I
suggest,
asked you
because
this,
I grew up with that story. My dad was a medical statistician, so I grew
oh,
up
is
with the story.
it?
Grew up with the dual story that the common cold will mutate to become a
Oh,
pandemic
wow.
virus in the next 100 years, and that there will be leaks from the lab, because we were thinking about eradicating smallpox but saving a bit. And he said inevitably there's human error and you have leaks from labs. This is. But he spoke about them differently. What we had when when COVID came was the two came together. So they're both highly likely.
Okay, well, I think it's the same answer. There's a statistical possibility that that's the case. I think it's because
I
there's a
think what happened
probably.
with, I mean, we're going on a bit, but I think what happened with COVID is people didn't like the pandemic we had. They kind of imagined we should have a different pandemic. It just wasn't what some people thought. Oh, this is exactly how a pandemic should be, and some people thought this is wrong, this is corrupt, or this is. I was thinking, well, how do you have a pandemic? I mean, if you agree that there is such a thing, what should it look like? Of course, it's. There you
We got to take this up.
go.
We got to take this up in a future podcast, Jonathan.
Okay, let's do that. Musa,
All
thank
right.
you very much. It's very nice talking to you. Thank you.
My pleasure, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.